The American Revolution is often seen as one of history's major turning points away from the monarchical system of Europe and towards the Republican era spearheaded by France, Britain, the Netherlands, and of course, the United States. But the Revolutionary War wasn't entirely set to be an enlightened Republican struggle from the start. The American colonies, of course, had deep ties to the British monarchy. This was especially the case in Crown Charter colonies like Pennsylvania and Maryland, who enjoyed the protection of the British Army and Navy. So much so, in fact, that an American officer referred to Pennsylvania as quote-unquote enemy's country during the Revolutionary War. The sentiment was also found in the backwater regions of the southern states. Backwater Carolina was referred to as the quote-unquote promised land of the Tories or British loyalists, and Virginia became a destination for the British aristocracy and sometimes even royalty to vacation prior to the Revolution, leading to widespread loyalist sympathies along its coast. Much of the loyalist sentiment outside of these specific examples was generally derived from the notion that revolution was simply immoral. Many settlers basically saw themselves as subjects of the British king, and as mentioned, many of the colonies were chartered directly by the crown. Thus, when tensions rose and the American Revolution broke out in 1775, it wasn't a unanimous decision. The Tories, people who believed in the stability and tradition of the monarchy and didn't want to sever ties with Britain, made up about 15 to 20% of the population. After the Revolution and during the birth of the United States under the highly decentralized Articles of Confederation, most of the loyalists either fled to Canada or Britain or were assimilated into the new Republican United States. But the spirit of monarchism, or at least classical conservatism, didn't entirely vanish. In these early years, some Americans were skeptical of the new system. There were even speculations that George Washington could be made a king, although he rejected such notions. Historical records recall two specific plans following the Revolution to install a monarch, or a power not too far from one, in the United States. The first of these was the Hamilton Plan. Hamilton's plan, sometimes referred to as the British Plan, drew heavily on his admiration for the British parliamentary monarchy. He envisioned a strong executive branch with a president who would serve for life, akin to a monarch, just without the hereditary right. This president, in Hamilton's view, would provide the stability and continuity necessary for the young republic to thrive. Additionally, Hamilton proposed a Senate composed of members who would also serve for life. This, he believed, would create a body of experienced and knowledgeable statesmen free from the fleeting whims of electoral politics. Together, this executive and Senate would form a powerful centralized authority capable of guiding the nation with a steady hand. Hamilton was a member of the Federalists, one of the two main factions in early America. The Federalists were the more conservative counterpart to the Democratic Republicans, who comprised the majority of the Founding Fathers and the early presidents. The Federalists believed in America which was highly centralized and had a strong executive, rather than a confederation of individual states which acted like countries in their own right. Many of the military leaders and Founding Fathers who helped America gain its independence from Britain were themselves Federalists or classical conservatives and believed that the struggle of the American Revolution was not necessarily against the concept of monarchism, but a revolution against an unfair tyrant from overseas who refused to rule all of his people with the same dignity and benevolence. In fact, George Washington himself was a Federalist in all but name, but Washington understood during his presidency that he had to give concessions to the Democratic Republicans in order to prevent a breakup of the country on political and regional lines. The second and lesser known of these plans was referred to as the Prussian Scheme. According to rumor, Nathaniel Gorham, president of the Continental Congress, offered the non-existent crown of the United States to Prince Henry of Prussia. As a member of the House of Hohenzollern, Prince Henry was a figure of considerable stature. Furthermore, the Prussian monarchy was, at the time, regarded highly by the American public, and, to sweeten the deal, Frederick the Great, Prince Henry's older brother, reportedly held a grudge with the British over their abandonment of the Prussians towards the end of the 7 Years' War. The whole idea behind the Prussian scheme was to resolve the political instability plaguing the nation under the Articles of Confederation. Uprisings like Shays' Rebellion had highlighted the weakness of the existing system, leading some, like Gorham, to seek a constitutional monarch who could provide provide the necessary stability. Of course, in spite of these efforts, Prince Henry showed no interest in becoming an American king. An unsent draft of a letter of Henry's was discovered in the Prussian archives, addressed to Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. In the letter, Henry explains that he is not interested in an quote-unquote American crown, but suggests that a French candidate would be better than a Prussian one. Regardless, the proposal never gained traction, and no mention was recorded by the Americans at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The conventioneers, meeting in secret, ultimately opted for a Republican form of government, and the United States of America as we know it today came into existence.
But what if all of that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the United States of America did in fact establish a monarchy, or at least something adjacent? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, consider joining the channel or submitting a scenario in our official Discord server linked below. Also, be sure to check out the new stickers we just dropped on our merch store. I personally designed these stickers and I'm very happy with the results, and buying one helps to support more content like this. Anyway, thanks and enjoy the video. To begin, we're going to need to lay down the ground rules. For this scenario, we'll be making two primary assumptions. The first is that the Federalists under Alexander Hamilton successfully moved to implement the strong federal model under the Hamilton Plan. The second assumption is that, for the sake of the scenario, Thomas Jefferson never even lives to see the end of the War for Independence. Whether captured by the British or mortally wounded during his evacuation from Virginia, Jefferson perishes and never rises as a prominent figure in the aftermath of the war, preventing him from growing into a force which could rally public dissatisfaction against the centralized plan of the Federalists, thus leaving the Hamiltonians with little to no major opposition. Only months following Hamilton's proposition of the plan, a new constitution would be drafted and accepted, one which would transform the loose confederation into a united dominion under the leadership of a Lord Governor, serving for life as an essential elected king, and see much of the British system transplanted and adopted for independent American use. While immediately there had been political opposition to this reform, the united influence of the pro-centralization coastal mercantile class, the urban middle class, and the elite plantation-owning populations across the states rang even louder, united by a fear of disunion, the rising threat of Native Americans and rural rebellions like that of Shays' Rebellion against the government, along with a desire to preserve and further the higher quality of life that achieved to make it more accessible to the rest of the American population. Now, of course, the Lord Governor would retain the title of Commander-in-Chief, and retain direct command over the national military. Under this newly established executive office would be subordinate state governors appointed directly by the Lord Governor and carrying out his orders at the local level. Congress would still retain a bicameral structure, though, as we stated earlier, senators would be appointed by the district electors of a state to serve for life, while representatives were elected by the people for 3-year terms. It's unclear how many members each House of Congress would have, though we could assume that for the House it would be population-based and for the Senate we would have something to do with the state's districts, if not merely using the 2 senators per state model. The judicial branch would remain nearly identical to its present form, with the executive nominating court justices and Congress confirming them to serve for life. However, it's unlikely that John Marshall or a similar figure would be appointed to the position of Chief Justice in this alternate timeline, meaning the Supreme Court could be a far less significant player in politics, and many of its responsibilities would likely be assumed by either the executive or legislative branches in effect. Finally, there would be a process for the appointment and removal of the Lord Governor. While he would serve for life, he would need to be appointed by an electoral college system. Hamilton had envisioned a model in which states were broken down into districts based on population and regional differences, and each region would be able to choose their independent electors, likely through a local vote. All the electors would then cast their votes for the next Lord Governor, with the majority vote deciding the winner, and if no candidate received a majority, the decision would go to the Senate. The executive was also liable to be removed from office for bad behavior, and this process is largely similar to the impeachment process we know of today, with the other 2 branches of government being able to check the power of the executive. With that being said, the obvious choice for this executive position would be George Washington, but the appointment wouldn't come easy. Washington was notoriously hesitant to take positions of power, as he valued highly the virtues of humility and self-sacrifice. Washington, in our own timeline, voluntarily resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned to his home at Mount Vernon following the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. This relinquishment of power was unprecedented and earned him admiration both domestically and abroad. It was something of the living embodiment of the principle that the nation's leaders should be subservient to its civilian authority. Later, after the new Constitution was ratified, Washington was the unanimous choice to become the first president of the United States. Now, despite his immense popularity, he was again hesitant to accept the presidency. Washington valued his privacy and longed for a peaceful retirement at Mount Vernon. In a letter to his friend Henry Knox, he expressed his reluctance, saying, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." And he had written earlier that, "Lest some unlikely event should happen unfavorable to my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with my utmost sincerity that I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," though this quote was in reference to his military command. Now, at the same time, Washington had a strong sense of duty to his land and his countrymen. If he would be the only viable choice for Lord Governor, so be it. And so, on the steps of Federal Hall in New York City, George Washington would be crowned the first Lord Governor of the United Kingdom of American States. Working title. George Washington's Lord Governorship would be characterized much like his presidency in our world, attempting to set examples and precedents for future rulers to follow, and attempting to further instill this new nobility of the nation with a sense of duty and responsibility to the common people, not to lose themselves in their desire for power. Washington and Hamilton, being the core pillars of the Federalist movement, understood that the relationship between ruler and ruled was reciprocal. Powerful as a ruler might be, he is bound by his own set of laws and standards that the public expects him to hold himself to, and a breach of this could be cause for disaster. Now, as much of a unifying figure as Lord Washington was, and as popular as he had been among the lower classes, the growing pains of a newly centralized nation brought about unrest and resistance to his rule from the inland regions, resistance which he himself personally had to put down, repeatedly pardoning the leadership of the different uprisings despite death having been the established punishment for such treasonous actions. Washington wanted to show himself to be an outstretched hand to the public. He understood their frustrations, and simply wanted them to cooperate for the betterment of all. These initial growing pains, however, would be more tremors compared to the first major challenge of Lord Governor Washington's reign. In the cold, rugged terrain of northern Massachusetts, within the disconnected Maine territory, a band of staunch loyalists, fed up with Washington's perceived illegitimacy, would rise in open rebellion against the states. The Tory Rebellion of New England rejected the new monarchical republic, seeking to reassert British control or integrate their territory into British Canada. The uprising quickly spread through towns and villages of what would become Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, as the rebels were assisted by pro-British, though unsanctioned, militias from the north. Washington would quickly mobilize the Continental Army, appointing General Henry Knox, a Federalist and hero of the Revolution, to lead the campaign against the rebels. As winter set in, Knox's forces marched from Salem, Massachusetts, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Washington himself rode in from the west, rallying the forces of the Vermont Republic to assist him. The Tories were pushed back, but caused a massive wave of destruction in their wake. By early 1790, a decisive battle at the Connecticut River saw the Loyalist forces shattered, their leaders captured or fleeing into Canada, solidifying the northern borders of Massachusetts and sending a clear message to the revolutionaries, both Tory and Republican. But it wasn't just rebellion from within that challenged Washington's rule. On the western frontier, another scuffle was brewing. The Northwest Indian War, sparked by American expansion into Native American territories, led to a battle between native confederacies supported covertly by the British and the Continental Army. Washington, Knox, and General Anthony Wayne would lead the American forces through the Ohio River territories to Fort Defiance. The campaign would be one of guerrilla warfare and unconventional engagements. Though the Native Americans typically refrained from battle during wintertime, they would launch strikes on the American settlements north of the river in January, building up to the distressing St. Clair's defeat in 1791. American forces would take the bitter loss and turn things around by 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where Wayne's forces dealt a crushing blow to the native confederacies. With the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, the Northwest Territories would finally be decisively under American control. Washington's victories, both against the Northern Tories and the Western Indians, solidified his reputation as a stabilizing force. But tensions with Britain would not be improved by the quick successive wars. The British, of course, looked at Washington's assertive measures with suspicion and anger. After all, George Washington was not even of noble birth. His throne was illegitimate and contrived. Such was the perception of Lord Washington by most of the European powers at the time. Nonetheless, pragmatism dictated their response. Britain still needed the American states as an economic partner within its sphere of influence. Open conflict was not in their immediate interest, and thus the proxy wars of early America would be the extent of Britain's intervention in the early nation. Come spring of 1797, Lord Washington would gather the nation's leaders in the Grand Hall of the newly constructed Federal House in Philadelphia. Addressing his people, Washington declared his intentions to lay down the mantle of leadership and return to his beloved Mount Vernon. The nation which indulges toward another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is to some degree a slave. We must strive to avoid the entanglements of foreign alliances and the dangers of internal factions. Our strength lies in our unity and in our commitment to the common good. And with that, Washington stepped back, a great weight lifting from his shoulders, and began his true retirement at Mount Vernon. Now, due to this deeply entrenched and vastly more powerful Federalist influence in the United States, Alexander Hamilton's ascension to the Lord Governorship was virtually guaranteed following Washington's abdication. Though his transition to power was far less seamless than Washington's, with many rural districts showing strong opposition to the centralizing figure who had become such a strong symbol of urban America and, indeed, the foreign immigrant population, many of whom were deemed undesirable Europeans, as opposed to Lord Washington, who was a native-born Virginia planter and managed to straddle a balance between both the farmer and the elite. While Lord Washington's popularity, military victories, and concentration on policy, which was deemed more immediately essential for the country's survival, allowed him to maintain the sympathy of those who might otherwise oppose him, Lord Hamilton would have been a far more polarizing executive. Many saw Hamilton as a supporter of the elite urbanists at the expense of rural landowners. They saw him as a suppressor of local power in the name of centralized national power, the enemy of the farmer and the friend of the merchant. This skepticism and even animosity towards Hamilton would be considerable, but without a force of democratic populism to rally and cohere it, many of these, we might consider Republican communities, would initially remain a silent plurality.
Hamilton's reign would restructure the country with an ambitious economic plan, focusing on establishing a national bank, assuming state debts, and fostering very early industrial growth. His vision extended beyond economics and defense too. He sought to forge a national mythos, a unifying identity that transcended regional divides. The centerpiece of this concept would be the planned city of Washington. Hamilton oversaw the construction of grand monuments and Romanesque statues dedicated to the founders and heroes of the Revolution. Hamilton appointed Benjamin Harry Latrobe to be the city's primary planner, known as the father of American classical literature, and the mind behind some of the most influential landmarks in early America, like the Fairmouth Waterworks in Philadelphia and the Bank of Pennsylvania. The city itself would be meticulously designed, with wide avenues and impressive architecture designed to inspire a sense of national pride and destiny. While all of this work was being done, the European continent was undergoing a time of intense turmoil. Only 2 years after Hamilton's ascension in 1799, the consulate would have taken power in revolutionary France after the Reign of Terror. For the British and Hamilton's America, the French Revolution would be a clear warning of the terror that republicanism could bring to a monarchical system, leading the former rivals to ease tensions between one another. France, once an ally during the fight for independence, now viewed these de facto monarchist American states with contempt. The tension culminated in a quasi-war against Consulate France over New Orleans and the French Louisiana Territory. In response, Hamilton embarked on a massive naval expansion. Unlike our own timeline, which saw Thomas Jefferson destroy any dreams of a competent early American navy, Hamilton saw the sea as America's future battleground. The US Navy grew formidable under his leadership, protecting American merchant vessels from French privateers in the Gulf of Mexico and along the coast. The quasi-war drew the US Army deep into the southern Louisiana Territory, where they clashed with French forces around New Orleans. At the same time, Hamilton's pursuit of friendly ties with Britain for the sake of trade and continental peace had turned many against him. To his critics, he seemed nothing more than a puppet of the British crown. His response to this dissent was harsh and uncompromising. Through the Alien and Sedition Acts, he imprisoned newspaper publishers who dared to slander him. It seemed as though every policy he put forward dealt a blow to his approval from the rural and anti-federalist populations. Hamilton's pursuit of additional taxation was meant to provide the country a means of quickly paying off its national debt and to provide for domestic developments, but was interpreted by them as a betrayal of the war for independence and a form of oppression which needed to be resisted. Hamilton's pursuit of national-level development and interconnectivity was meant to foster unity and a higher quality of life, but was interpreted as forced urbanization and the erasure of each state's unique culture. His pursuit of tariffs and protectionist policies meant to bolster and support the country's emerging domestic manufacturing sector would be interpreted as a suffocation of agricultural communities which depended on open trade to import prefabricated material and export domestically grown crops. His pursuit of a central bank meant to provide stability to the American currency and allow for a management of debt and credit would be interpreted as a crushing of local banking and state autonomy in the name of foreign elites. However, the final blow to his rural support base came with the decision to contain slavery to the states where it already existed, with the ultimate goal of total abolition. This move alienated not only the rural commoners but also the powerful planter elite. They saw it as a direct threat to their finances, political influence, and way of life. With little to no support left south of Virginia, Hamilton's power was waning. In the middle of this political turmoil, a new figure emerged to rally rural America. Andrew Jackson, a son of the frontier and southern Appalachia, was gaining recognition. A local lawyer and military man, Jackson burned with support for the Republican cause. He was raised in a rural Democratic Republican movement which had no moderate Madisonian forces to guide it, nor Jeffersonian forces to be its voice. Because of this lack of outlet, the Republican movement would become parallel to that of France's, a violent revolutionary force with no means to voice its concerns. Inspired by the French, by 1805, Jackson began to rally people in the South and Appalachia, leading the Tennessee State Militia in a revolution against Lord Governor Hamilton. Jackson's call to arms resonated deeply. The revolution spread across the Union, even causing civil unrest in Philadelphia, the heart of Hamilton's power. As the conflict began to boil in North America, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France in 1804. His rise coincided with the death of Lord Hamilton. The new Lord Governor, Daniel Webster, took office amidst a chaotic backdrop. Webster, yet another Federalist, was described as a man of great potential, a masterpiece of his time. Yet he was also a man who swayed with the words of his advisors. Webster faced an immediate and daunting challenge. The secessionist movement led by Jackson was gaining momentum, and the specter of civil war was on the horizon. In our own timeline, Webster, who was Secretary of State under William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, and Millard Fillmore, was, in his last years of life, a dedicated Unionist and had a deep resentment for the Southern Democrats who were calling for secession during the build-up to the Civil War. Thus, as Lord Governor, he would respond to Jackson's tirade in turn in order to suppress the revolutionaries and restore confidence in his government. Napoleon, now at the helm in France, began to take an interest in the American conflict. He saw an opportunity to weaken British influence and began funding Jackson's rebellion while sending troops to Louisiana to protect French territories as the quasi-war was still in full swing. While during the war, the Americans under Lord Hamilton and now Lord Webster had been making significant gains in the underpopulated Great Plains, progress just north of New Orleans was much slower. The cordial relationship with Britain, forged during Hamilton's tenure, was more crucial than ever. By 1805, the War of the Third Coalition was underway, and Britain had begun its foray into the Napoleonic Wars. Reluctantly, Webster would call upon the British for assistance in Louisiana. Thus, the Greater Napoleonic Wars now expanded their grim tendrils into the Americas. Spanish troops supporting Jackson's rebellion from Florida intensified the clash. British ships descended through the Mississippi River, reaching New Orleans to reinforce the Americans. The combined might of American soldiers, hired Prussian and German mercenaries, and a modest contingent of British forces began targeting the decentralized Jacksonian militias.
As this continued, Napoleon would begin to lose confidence in the American theater. He was bogged down in Europe, attempting to overwhelm the mighty British Navy, and a losing battle over a strip of American land kept falling lower on the list of priorities. And the rebels under Jackson faced mounting challenges. Native American tribes who still held significant control over some parts of North America began to sabotage his forces, exploiting their lack of defenses in the rural regions and the hindquarters of their battle formations. The Americans took this opportunity and made a push deep into the Jacksonian territory at this point. Jackson was thus forced to retreat to the city of New Orleans, as the Americans followed. This Battle of New Orleans would see Jackson on the defensive. Lord Governor Webster's forces besieged the city, and though they put up a good fight, Jackson's militias and the remaining French holdouts were outmatched as the British Navy bombarded the city and the Americans marched in on foot. The battle ended in a decisive defeat for Andrew Jackson, who fled with the remnants of his forces into the Appalachian hinterlands. The Treaty of Philadelphia would formally end the conflict with France. Louisiana would be ceded to the United States only months after the Battle of Trafalgar had humiliated the British Navy in Europe. But in the Appalachian Mountains, Jackson and his followers would establish a decentralized confederation whose government was loosely based on the original Articles of Confederation, declaring themselves the true successors to the American Revolution and an independent force from the United Kingdom of American States. Again, working title. Their challenge to the authority of the American government would not lapse soon, but for now they were contained and not a significant threat. On top of this, Lord Governor Daniel Webster's legacy was now solidified through his decisive victory over the rebels and his acquisition of the Louisiana Territory. The successful suppression of a Republican rebellion, an antidote of sorts to the French Revolution, brought the monarchies of Europe to accept these American states as a legitimate European polity. The American Lord Governorship, it seemed, had braved the troubles of its inception and emerged with newfound strength. Now, whether or not the system will continue as a stabilizing force, a force of order, and of union, well, only time may be able to tell. And that's where we'll end this video for today. A special thanks to our good friend Lavender for joining us in the creation of this video. You can check out his channel, where he regularly posts historical and political content from a national conservative and monarchist perspective, using the links in the description. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord, which Lavender sometimes makes an appearance in, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.